Global Food Regulatory Science Society. G-Force mission includes knowledge generation and dissemination, underpinning food regulatory decisions, in support of food control systems. Consistent reliance on food regulatory sciences enables robust food control programs.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on pressure-driven risk management practices for allergens in food. My name is Dr. Ruba Gusous, and I am currently working as a food expert at Jordan Food and Drug Administration, JFDA, and a member of the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, G-Force. I'm pleased to be your moderator today for this fourth webinar organized by G-Force as part of its Food Regulatory Science webinar series, and to have participants from all around the world today. Last week, G-Force and its strategic partners have organized the third Global Food Regulatory Science Symposium as part of Dubai's International Food Safety Conference. So let's watch together a summary of this event before we start our webinar. So before I introduce our speakers and the topic, please note that Arabic interpretation is available for this webinar. Additionally, we encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation via the chat box. We will have a dedicated Q&A segment following our speaker's talk to address your questions. So, allergen. Allergens are a major concern for food processors and regulatory bodies worldwide, especially when it comes to protecting allergic consumers from potentially severe reactions. In this webinar, we will explore how we can improve reliance on threshold-driven practices and reduce the need for precautionary allergen labeling like may contain statement which can be challenging for both consumers and industry. Today, we will look closely at guidelines developed through a Canadian initiative involving food processors, allergic consumers, and university researchers and health professionals. These guidelines are designed to help processors implement effective allergen control plans by aligning with the latest international recommendations. The aim of this work is to provide insights into better serving allergic consumers while enhancing food safety standards. We're looking forward to a valuable discussion that will contribute to better allergen management practices across the industry. Today, we are fortunate to have three distinguished speakers who will share their insights on threshold-driven risk management practices for allergen in food. Mrs. Beatrice Povolo graduated from the University of Toronto with an honors in a bachelor's degree in political science and economics. She serves as the Director of Food Safety and Regulatory Affairs at Food Allergy Canada, where she leads the organization's food safety initiatives, collaborating with both government and industry stakeholders. Her work focuses on improving access to accurate ingredient information in food labeling and food services. Mrs. Povolo is also actively involved in international discussions on allergen management as part of the Health Canada delegation to the Codex Committee on Food Labeling, which is currently meeting for its third day. Additionally, she works closely with patient organizations worldwide to advance food safety standards. Professor Samuel Godefroy, a professor in food risk analysis and regulatory practices at the University Laval, Canada. President of the International Union of Food Science and Technology, IFOST, and President and COO of the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, GFORCE. Dr. Sylvia Dominguez is a food engineer specialized in food safety risk assessment, allergen management, and data modeling. She holds a master's and PhD in food science from Rutgers University, US. She also currently works as a research associate at the Food Risk Analysis and Regulatory Excellence Platform, hosted by the Institute of Nutrition Functional Foods of University Laval, Quebec, Canada, where she manages academic research projects as well as food safety capacity building initiatives for competent authorities at the international level. Thank you all once again for joining us today. It's truly a privilege to be moderating this webinar alongside such esteemed experts. Their expertise and perspectives on the critical topic will help us better understand the latest advancement in allergen management and responsible labeling practices. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mrs. Povolo.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the honor of being here today. We're really excited to give you a quick overview of what food allergy means from the consumer perspective, and then move forward with Dr. Bourgeois and Dr. Dominguez to talk some of the specifics around some of the updates we have from an international perspective, as well as an overview of the guidelines. Advance the slide, please. I'm sorry, I'm not able to see the slide deck on my end.
Not yet.
Oh, not yet. Okay.
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 Is it okay now? You can
Yes.
see it?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. You can go ahead and advance the slide, please. Or do I have control here?
The second slide.
Great. So just a quick agenda that I just mentioned in terms of what we'll be covering today. Next slide, please. Just wanted to acknowledge that the work that we've done here in Canada on this initiative has been funded in part by the Government of Canada through their agri-assurance program. So we're very grateful for their contribution to this project. Next slide, please. Right. So as I mentioned, I'm going to give you a quick overview in terms of what food allergy looks like for consumers, not only in Canada, but worldwide. So the reality is when we talk about food allergy, IgE-mediated food allergy, there is currently no cure. So individuals with food allergies are told to avoid the food that they're allergic to as their prime strategy for prevention. However, what that means is that they need to be vigilant in all of the areas that they encounter on a daily basis. So they need to be vigilant at home, at school, in the workplace, and any time that food is being served or prepared for them. At the end of the day, what all consumers need is they need to know what's in their food in order to be able to make some safe choices. Unfortunately, accidents do happen through various scenarios. So they also need to be prepared to treat a reaction with epinephrine should it occur. So all of this really kind of plays into the daily management of food allergy. And again, what it means at the end of the day is ensuring that consumers have access to ingredient information that is accurate and that is complete so that they can make choices for themselves or those in their family that have food allergy to be able to stay safe. Next slide, please. Here in Canada, the regulatory framework when it comes to intentionally added foods or ingredients, including allergens, is very clear. They must be indicated in the label, in the ingredient list, or in a contained statement if it's used on a product, and it must be used in plain, simple English or French, which are the primary languages here in Canada. But the direction there is quite clear. However, where we don't have clarity and there's no specific regulation from Health Canada regarding precautionary allergen labeling or may contain statements, these are still can be voluntarily used by industry to communicate a potential risk of unintended presence to consumers that have food allergy. It must be truthful and not misleading, and it must not take the place or substitute for good manufacturing practices. And the intention is for it to be used only when when all reasonable measures have been taken to avoid unintended presence. However, what's happened over the years is that there has been a proliferation of these types of statements, in some cases overuse and in some cases misuse, which has really eroded the trust of consumers in those statements. When Health Canada first put together this guidance back in 2012, their two goals for PAL was to minimize risk for consumers with food allergy by being able to communicate a level of risk to them through that type of statement, and to maximize the choices for consumers. And as I've mentioned, over the past decades, unfortunately, those particular goals have not necessarily been met, in the sense that it is something that has been used by industry in various ways and not always in the best interest of the consumer. Next slide, please. Just to give you an example of some of the challenges that consumers face when it comes to labeling for PAL, I'm just going to quickly go over 3 different examples. The first one on the left-hand side of the screen, which we refer to as blanket statement. And this is basically a precautionary label that lists all or the majority of priority allergens on the label. So in this particular case, it was an apple pie that was being sold at a local grocery store. It had an accurate ingredient list, but the may contain that was included had all the priority allergens, and the ones that aren't included were in the ingredient list. So essentially, anybody with a food allergy to those priority allergens would not be able to consume that particular product. We've seen more and more of these types of statements, and unfortunately, from a consumer perspective, what it really indicates is that particular company may not have very good manufacturing practices in place if they're not able to avoid unintended presence for all allergens. So these types of statements are not helpful for consumers, and if anything, they really erode the trust in the label. The other issue that consumers face here in Canada specifically, and in other jurisdictions, is that the use of may contain has moved into areas it was never intended for. So prepackaged product is really where PAL has been, the guidance has been provided. However, we've also seen these types of statements in grocery stores, in bulk food departments. The example we have here is of a meat counter at a local grocery store that has an allergen warning, again, for all allergens in that specific sector. Again, this type of labeling or this type of warning is not really suitable for these types of environments because that's where PAL was not intended. We're also seeing it in restaurants and food service where there's allergy notices, again, indicating that all, one or all of allergens could have potentially cross-contacted food in these areas. So again, this type of overextension of PAL is not useful, and again, is causing confusion and challenging for consumers and their families with food allergy. Next slide, please. There's also been some concerning trends that we've seen over the past couple of years that I just quickly like to highlight in terms of some of the issues that we're facing. One of them, as many of you may know, in the US, they passed the FASTER Act that came into effect in January in 2023, where sesame was added as a priority allergen. In Canada, sesame has been a priority allergen since the beginning, and we have been managing, I would say, in a fairly positive way in terms of how it's been managed with our industry. What we started to see in the US once sesame was added is that some companies in the baking sector were including sesame as the last ingredient on the ingredient list to avoid using a precautionary allergen label. That type of practice, as we all know, is not something that is encouraged or is considered good manufacturing practices, and unfortunately can set a precedent for other allergens. So it's something that we're watching. I know there's been many discussions happening over the last 18 months on this issue, but something, again, that we're not seeing here in Canada, thankfully, and we would like not to be able to see that worldwide as well. The other issue is e-commerce sale. As we all know, all consumers, including those with food allergy, shop online. With the pandemic, that became even more paramount, where people were ordering food to their homes, both from food service and restaurants, as well as prepackaged products through grocery or third-party applications. The challenge for consumers, however, is that the amount of information that's disclosed on these grocery store third-party platforms does not always contain full ingredient information. And specifically, in majority of the cases, the precautionary allergen label, if it's on the package, doesn't always appear and through the e-commerce site, which makes it very difficult for consumers to make informed choices when they're ordering online. There's just an example at the bottom of a pasta brand. This is the information that's provided online. When the pasta brand arrives, it does have a may contain for egg, which was not disclosed at the point of sale. So issues like that are concerning, and they're also make it very difficult for consumers to order and to find safe choices. Next slide, please. And finally, I just want to quickly touch on vegan products. These are very popular here in Canada as they are worldwide. And because of the nature of vegan products, where they're not to have any animal byproduct, including things like milk and egg, they have actually attracted consumers with these particular food allergies as potentially safe options. However, that's not always the case. In Canada, in 2022, the CFIA had over 47 recalls for milk products. Of those products, 22% were dark chocolate, and of that, 50% had a vegan claim. So consumers are looking at vegan claims as a form of free from, in the sense that they should not have milk or egg. However, when they do look at the package, in many cases, they'll turn it and they will see a may contain for milk or egg on the back. So it becomes quite confusing. And although these particular products weren't intended for an allergic population, again, they've attracted their attention because of the way that they're supposed to be created, supposed to be manufactured. So again, we're looking to have more clarity around vegan claims, especially as they pertain to food allergy. And there was a wonderful study that was published by our colleagues at Laval that looked at this issue, and I highly encourage you to take a look at that. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean from a consumer perspective, and what is the resulting behavior that we're seeing? So unfortunately, what we're seeing is consumers making their own risk assessment to ensure that they have adequate food choice. They're balancing the risks and benefits of consuming products with PAL, because in some situations, they don't have many options that are available. The perception of the product actually having a specific allergen in it, or all the allergens, as we've looked at before, come into play when consumers are making their decision. They also look at the type of allergen and whether or not they've consumed the product previously without a reaction. So unfortunately, what the results have been is that we have some consumers purchasing more foods with PAL than they have previously, again, for looking for options for themselves or their family, and they lack confidence in the label that has a quality of life impact. So again, both of these scenarios not something that we want to move towards safer practices for individuals with food allergy. Next slide, please. So as a result of that, and working with our colleagues at Laval and others within the food industry, we came together to develop a set of guidelines that are really meant to improve allergen control plans for Canadian manufacturers, taking a risk-based approach and ensuring that from a manufacturing perspective, that there are adequate and robust plans in place, as well as a specific practice for precautionary allergen labeling. All of that culminating to ensure that there's accurate labeling for consumers that they can trust. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Samuel Godefroy to give us an overview on the international meetings that are happening currently and some advances that we're seeing internationally. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Beatrice. And good morning to you all from Quebec City. And again, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this webinar. And as Beatrice indicated, in fact, this webinar is organized practically at the same time, in fact, in parallel with the meeting that is hosted here in Quebec City this week, the 48th session of the Codex Committee on Food Labeling. And as you know, allergen management has been a topic of interest for Codex for a number of years. And if we go to the next slide, please, Hajar, and the following one. This is, in fact, what I will be attempting to share with you, which is really an overview of the way the Codex Alimentarius Commission, through its various committees, and certainly through the interest of the Codex Committee on Food Labeling, has been dealing with food allergens and providing guidance and some of the current work that is being considered, in fact, this week in Quebec City. So the key standard and the key guidance on allergens and allergen labeling was developed by the Codex Committee on Food Labeling with a standard that was adopted in 1999 in the form of an amendment to the general standard for the labeling of prepackaged food, where essentially specific provisions were developed to identify mandatory requirements for the labeling of allergens, specific allergens that are known to be priority allergens when they are added deliberately in the composition of foods. In fact, this standard was a milestone globally because it led subsequently to a number of regulatory changes around the world. And when we look at the regulations on allergen labeling around the world, we notice that they are very much inspired from this particular standard. Codex actually then did not do much work on allergens until 2018, 2019, where another committee, the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene, took the leadership in developing a guidance in the form of a code of practice to food industry in order to enhance food allergen management. And subsequently, basically the interest on allergens continued, and we have witnessed, in fact, an interest to look at the regulatory environment internationally and to update the international guidance on food allergen management, not only on labeling, but also on the way industry practices are to be managed, and with a particular emphasis on this specific labeling that has been used for risk management purposes that we call the precautionary allergen labeling. Now, of course, to do so, Codex needed some scientific advice, and there was a need to update the scientific information on the basis of which risk management decisions are to be made. And the next slide. That's essentially what was identified in the early years of the beginning of this work, so around 2019, 2020. It was identified that there were a number of questions that needed to be answered, and both CCFH, so the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene, but also the Codex Committee on Food Labeling, formulated 3 questions for an FAO WHO expert consultation on risk assessment of food allergens. The first question was related to updating the list of what we call priority allergens. And this is, of course, recognizing that several foods have the potential to be allergens. Simply, if you have a protein-containing food, it can be an allergen. But which ones are more important from a risk management standpoint? And in fact, in this question, there was also a request to update the criteria upon which countries, but also Codex could consider to identify an ingredient to be a priority allergen. The second question was related to thresholds, and this is stemming from the understanding that an allergic reaction is a threshold-driven reaction. There is, in fact, the possibility to identify a level of exposure to proteins that may be present in a food where essentially the allergic consumer would not have a reaction. So what would be those thresholds? Because knowing these thresholds would be an important element to contribute, again, to risk management. And the third question was specifically dedicated to precautionary allergen labeling, stemming from the fact that, as Beatrice mentioned, there was a proliferation of the use of precautionary allergen labeling. Those may contain statements. And while this instrument used to be a very good risk management approach because it helps consumers identify some foods that they may need to avoid, where the allergen this time has not been added as an ingredient, meaning as part of the formulation of the food, but could not be avoided. Now, because of this proliferation of use, because also of the lack of guidance around this, there was a need really to update the scientific foundation on the basis of which Codex could develop risk management approaches for precautionary allergen labeling. Now, I'm going to share with you in the next slides some of the outputs of the expert consultation. The first output was related to the risk assessment. And in this particular case, the expert group validated 3 key criteria on the basis of which allergens can be considered as priority allergens. First of all, it's the prevalence. So, and again, if we are looking at this from a global perspective, we're looking at the global prevalence of food allergies. Now, if we're looking at it from a regional perspective, and we could consider that, it could be the regional prevalence of certain food allergies. The second criterion is the potency. So essentially, that small amounts of allergens are likely to induce a higher reaction. So the more potent the ingredient is with its allergenic potential, the more likely it would be taken as part of the priority list. And the third criterion is the severity of the reaction. And again, we know that exposure to some allergens by the susceptible population is likely to induce, some reactions that can lead to anaphylaxis and potentially a loss of life. So those 3 criteria were looked at, and the list of priority allergens that was previously adopted by Codex was reviewed. And in fact, what we arrived at, and this is the recommendation that came up from this expert consultation, the vast majority of the list was further validated. There were a couple of changes. Soy, for example, was no longer identified for its global relevance as a priority allergen and was moved to the regional list of priority allergens. So from the standpoint of the prevalence, it would be fit more as a regional one. We have identified sesame, as was mentioned earlier by Beatrice, as a priority allergen from a global perspective, and this was recommended. There was also more clarification as to specific tree nuts that would be worthy of being identified as priority allergens and not necessarily mentioning the generic word tree nuts. Also, what the expert group did, they have identified other allergens of regional relevance, for example, celery, lupin, and mustard. And the expert group also identified another set of ingredients that are important to consider on a so-called watch list, simply because of their increased prevalence of use in processed applications. And those are the likes of pulses, or, for example, insect-derived proteins or insect-derived ingredients. We move to the next slide, please. For the second question, and this is related to whether it is possible to develop thresholds on the basis of which we could base some risk management strategies. So those levels that we can use essentially to define the reaction of consumers. What the expert group recommended was levels based on clinical information that was gathered internationally, levels that would enable to protect about 95% of the population. So basically, at those levels that were identified for a priority list of allergens, we would have 5% or less of consumers that would be reacting. And those levels were developed in the form of a list, and they were also identified so as reference doses in milligrams of total protein from the allergenic source. But of course, if we are developing these thresholds, the expert group also recommended that we look at the analytical applications, so the methods of analysis that are at the disposal of risk managers, whether be it industry or regulators, to be able to identify the markers of allergens, and such that basically the combination of those two tools, the analytical tool, but also the knowledge of thresholds of reactivity, would allow us to develop sensible and evidence-based risk management practices. And this brings us to the third question, so the next slide, where the expert group attempted to respond to the third question: what would be the scientific foundation that could be used to guide risk management approaches, such that we can reinstate the value of a precautionary allergen labeling? And to reinstate this value, basically the idea is to say that this label or this practice cannot be made lightly. It has to be derived from an assessment of a situation, an assessment of the situation where we look at all the practices that have been applied from a risk management standpoint to avoid the introduction of the allergen. But then, if there is, this potential is still there, we would conduct a risk assessment, whether be it a qualitative risk assessment or a quantitative risk assessment. But should we resort to a quantitative one, then basically the approach will be based on an attempt of exposure determination. And if we determine, according to this risk assessment, that the level of exposure to the unintended presence of allergens exceeds those reference doses that were established and that we reported on previously, then this would be a good justification to apply a precautionary allergen labeling. If we are in the reverse situation, meaning we are at a level of exposure that would be lower than those reference doses, then perhaps again, this precautionary allergen labeling is no longer justified, because then we would be contributing, if we use it, we would be contributing to that proliferation. And the next slide, so this guidance has been used now for the last 2 to 3 years by the Codex Committee on Food Labeling, but also has been considered also at the last session of the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene. It is, in fact, this guidance that is right now driving the discussions underway in Quebec City. In fact, this morning, we will continue discussions on the way precautionary allergen labeling and a guideline, is a dedicated guideline on the way precautionary allergen labeling ought to be applied using, again, this guidance. And in fact, as was discussed earlier by Beatrice, one of the elements that we know will occur is that once Codex was, or progresses in the adoption of an updated guideline, there will be a need for more guidance to food industry. and availability of tools. And I guess this was what was attempted through the multi-stakeholder project that we are reporting on today, sharing with you the Canadian experience in this context. So again, we'll stay tuned to see what the outputs of today and tomorrow's discussions at CCFL will be. And again, happy to share with you how essentially we arrived at those Canadian guidelines for the management of food allergens. Once again, thank you for the opportunity. And I believe now we will move to our next speaker with the next slide, Dr. Sylvia Dominguez and Dr. Beatrice Povolo. So
Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Sammy. Thank you for the introduction. Beatrice also, and thank you to G-Force for allowing us to share this initiative in a more international scope. So what I'm going to present today is an overview of the guidelines for allergen management that we developed in Canada with a council of stakeholders. This is not going to be a training on the content, but it's going to be an overview. We're going to direct you to the resources and tell you what you can find in this document. Next slide, please. So first of all, before we go into details, I just want to tell you a bit on how we reached this, the development of these resources. This is not something that we just invented here at Laval University or with Food Allergy Canada. No, we actually went through a very long process where we reviewed existing literature, we consulted with our stakeholders, we actually generated also new data, we surveyed consumers, we surveyed manufacturers, and we wrote a lot with our council members. So we had a writing committee from the industry that directly participated in this, the writing of this document, which was also validated by external collaborators, even at the international level. And what we're going to present today is the first version of these guidelines that is expected to be updated as new data or new developments occur. So we hope that this will bring, our purpose was to present you with allergen management best practices that are internationally recognized, that have the input of Canadian manufacturers, and especially a structured risk assessment approach to guide PAL decisions, and in the end, to better meet the needs of allergic consumers. Next slide, please. So this is the table of contents of the guidelines document. As you can see, it covers introductory sections, of course, on food allergy and regulatory requirements. But then the focus is, of course, on allergen management. This is the core of the document. And it basically describes in detail how to develop an allergen control plan. Each of the elements in this process, so the process of developing an allergen control plan, are depicted in the figure on the side. So you can see we have steps from A through E. The first 4 steps, so identify allergen hazards, identify control measures, implement or improve control measures, and evaluate their effectiveness, are really not different as a concept from what you know already, most likely in the context of HACCP plans, for example. The difference here is that we present them as a more thorough version targeting specifically allergens. And that, well, as we said before, this comes from recommendations from the international experts and Canadian manufacturers' experience. I'm not going to spend much time on these first 4 elements during the presentation, but each of these sections is very well explained in the document. I just want to highlight that section C, implement control measures, is very, very thorough. Control measures are, of course, specific to the facility, the product, the process, etc. But we do provide extensive strategies and resources that could be applicable to a number of operations. And each manufacturer would then use them to apply them directly or adapt them to their specific risks. The last element, however, letter E, communicate risks, is where we go in our guidelines beyond what's currently available in other allergen management resources. And this is where we'll focus the rest of the presentation. Next slide, please. So yes, as I was saying, I'm going to continue more on risk communication. Okay, and this is the same process flow you saw in the previous slide, but we have expanded it to show the steps related to risk communication specifically. As we all know, so the first one, the first diamond, as we all know, allergens that are added as ingredients must be declared on a product's labels. This is usually part of the regulatory framework. And these allergens should have been relatively easily identified during the hazard identification step, right? They come with the ingredients, usually. The next step is not that simple, is assessing the need for PAL. So this is where we're going to spend more time here, because we do often talk about, okay, PAL should be based on risk assessment, but how, as manufacturers, what are we supposed to do to fulfill this requirement? So the premise of the approach we present is that PAL must only be used to communicate the unintentional, unavoidable presence of allergens that are present at a level that poses a risk to food allergic consumers as determined by a risk assessment. So how do we do this risk assessment? So what we propose is that this should be first a qualitative assessment, and I will explain all this in the following slides. But this qualitative assessment would follow a weight of evidence approach, and only if this is inconclusive, we will move on to a quantitative one where we rely on comparison to reference doses, as Sami was explaining. So let me go more into detail into first the qualitative assessment in the next slide. This is basically a review of the process, of the entire manufacturing process based on objective evidence of when allergen control measures pass or may fail. So the key word here is objective evidence, objective. And this is something that manufacturers most likely already have. I'm pretty sure they have. So this is, for example, could be validation, cleaning program validation studies, recognized cleaning standards, training records, etc. We need to consider, however, in a qualitative approach, that some factors can have either a stronger effect or a more direct effect on the occurrence of the unintentional allergen that we're studying. And this is what we incorporate in the weight of evidence approach. So we would give some measures a stronger weight than others. Also, we need to note that this type of assessment could be influenced by the experience of the person conducting it. So it's better to consider a multidisciplinary team, not just one person, and that every member should have a thorough knowledge of the operation as a whole or of certain parts of the operation. So as you see in the process flow on the right, let's say you gathered already and assessed all your objective evidence. What do you do with it? You actually can reach decisions already regarding PAL at this point, because you may find yourself in a situation where you have sufficient supporting evidence that control measures can consistently prevent the occurrence of the unintended allergen. So here we won't need PAL. The opposite could be true, that your evidence shows you that control measures cannot prevent the occurrence of the unintended allergen, and here, of course, PAL would be necessary. Or you may be at an in-between situation where you're not sure. The evidence is insufficient, so it cannot really tell you if they're effective or not in controlling the unintentional allergen presence. And here we would move on to a quantitative assessment. But first, let's look in the next slide at an example of a qualitative assessment. So here we're going to pretend we're a baking operation, okay? And we make cookies. So let's say we have a cookie that we're going to call A that contains milk, and that we process it right before another cookie that we'll call B that does not contain milk. So do we need PAL for milk in the cookie that is processed right after? This is the question the manufacturer is asking. So if you click, please, we will see the evidence that was collected. Can you press click? Yes, thank you. So as I said, what we do in a qualitative assessment is we gather qualitative, objective evidence, and this we're going to organize it per production step. What we're going to do is see at each step in a large, well, you can go as narrow as you wish, but here we're presented it in large buckets, let's say. In each of these steps, we will see which allergen control measures we have and what does the evidence shows us about their efficacy. So you usually have at the raw materials level several allergen control measures that are usually related to identification of the allergen, segregation, storage, etc. So here we have that the allergen that concerns us is milk, and it's actually in the form of skim milk powder. And this is a very evident allergen. You can identify it easily. And receiving procedures are in place. Personnel are trained. We haven't had deviations. So milk is consistently labeled as milk and is stored where it should be stored and kept segregated. So the evidence shows us that everything is going good at this step. However, cross-contact, the one that concerns us, the transfer of milk from the cookie A to the cookie B, is not likely to occur at this step. So although these control measures are essential, for this risk assessment, we'll give it a weak weight because it's not influencing the result we're looking for. At the second step that we have here, design of premises and equipment, this is usually related to equipment that allows for proper cleaning. In this case, the equipment indeed is recent and well designed, so proper cleaning is achieved. But again, as the same case of raw materials, this is not where we're going to find the way to control our unintentional allergen presence, the one that concerns this assessment. So again, although this is very important, we're giving it a weak weight because we cannot directly prevent cross-contact at this step. Regarding production, as you noticed, it would have been a simple solution just to invert the order, right? We can process the product with the allergen at the end. But just for the sake of our example, we're going to say we cannot do that. So then what do we do? What does the manufacturer do? They actually acknowledge that there is milk, that milk is an allergen in this product. So they address it in changeover procedures, right? They have all their labeling, changing of equipment, tools, etc., labels. The training of changeover personnel is adequate. They do it at the required frequency, so we're good there. So this is important. It's getting to the point where we will more directly influence or not the presence of cross-contact in our cookie B, because it's a very important step to acknowledge that there was an allergen being processed before. However, we cannot ensure the absence of cross-contact only by following our changeover procedure. So we're giving at this step a medium weight. Now we're at the cleaning step. Here we have a cleaning program that consistently meets a visually clean standard. So regularly they conduct the cleaning, everything's good. We said the equipment didn't hinder cleaning, so easier like that. There's also been a validation study, this is very important, for this specific cleaning procedure that included analytical tests that demonstrated that milk proteins are not detected in the cookie B when it's processed after A and when cleaning is conducted following the standard procedure. And this is a robust and a recent study, so this is very good. And then regularly, routinely, cleaning is verified. Apart from the visual clean standard, there's also a milk detection test on surfaces that's being conducted as part of the cleaning verification. So now we have very strong evidence that cleaning assures no visible residues visible, and also there's been an analytical test that reports undetectable milk proteins in B from the validation study. So now here we do have very strong evidence that control measures as a combination, not only this one, this is the strongest, but as a combination, control measures can consistently prevent the occurrence of milk in the cookie B when it's produced after A. So with this evidence, the manufacturer feels comfortable saying that BAL for milk is not required. Next slide, please. So that was an example of a qualitative assessment. You saw we didn't actually use any reference doses. We can already tell that this is well controlled from our qualitative point of view. Now let's say we didn't have such a conclusive evidence, so we would consider a quantitative assessment. And here we will need numerical data because here we will compare, we will have an allergen protein exposure dose that comes from consumption of a food, and we will compare it to an allergen protein dose that is predicted not to trigger a reaction in most of the allergic population. So this would be the thresholds or the reference doses that Sammy was mentioning before. We will use a reference dose and we will calculate our exposure dose, compare it to the reference dose to see if we are above, so if our concentration in the food, the dose in the food is higher, we will need a PAL to warn consumers of this risk. And let's look into an example to better understand how we do this in the next slide, please. So in this example, we're going to say we're a manufacturer that produces chips and that they use an ingredient, seasoning mix or spice mix that carries PAL for soy. So they receive an ingredient that says may contain soy. The chips manufacturer would like to know if they need to carry forward this may contain soy to their finished product, which are the chips. They tried to do a qualitative assessment. We're going to say it was not conclusive. So now they're going to try a quantitative one. So as we said, an important part of a quantitative assessment is the reference doses, because this is a reference point where we're going to compare it to. So as you know, there are no regulatory requirements for the use of PAL in some jurisdictions like Canada. In others, there are now, like in the Netherlands. So in any case, for our example, we're going to say we're going to use values that are found in the literature, and they're going to use the dose of 0.5 milligrams soy proteins that's estimated by Australia's VITAL program that would protect 99% of soy allergic individuals. So this is the ED01. As you see, the ED05 is much larger, it's 10. And also notice that from the FAO WHO, we don't have a value because soy is no longer in the global priority allergens list. Okay, so we have the value that we're going to use to compare. If we are above this value, we need PAL. If we're below, we don't. As you saw in the previous slide, now the next thing we need to do is calculate our exposure dose from the food we produce. And for that, we need two values, which are the amount of the food consumed and the concentration of allergen in this food. So let's move on now to the amount of food consumed. Here, what we need to know is a reasonable, very large maximum amount, actually, that a person would consume in one eating occasion. So in one sitting, not in one day or in 1 week. In one sitting, you eat this food. What is the largest reasonable that someone would eat? So here, chips, we have chips that is a type of food that is usually consumed in one single eating occasion, right? You don't open a bag of chips and eat one in the morning, one in the afternoon, one in the evening. And with this, the manufacturer, we're going to say it was in Canada. So they referred to, in Canada, we have a consumption survey, a representative national consumption survey. This is something special. It's not always available. And we have a category called savory snacks. And they give us an average daily intake for consumers that is about 42 grams, if I remember. And 50% of consumers consume 27 grams or less. So here, since chips, we said, are consumed in one eating occasion, most likely, we can use this survey data because this survey, by the way, is a nutritional survey, so it presents you with daily consumption. But as we said, we don't expect savory snacks to be eating a bag throughout the day, so we can use this in this case, but this is something to be aware of. So the serving size on our chips label is 28 grams. So based on the information of the average consumer, the median consumption, the manufacturer estimates that 2 bags of chips, so 56 grams in total, would be a worst case eating occasion. Now, notice this is definitely not a fixed value, okay? If ever, we can also do simulations for 3 bags of chips or 4 bags of chips to see where we're at risk level. But in this case, we're going to start and continue with 2 bags of chips just to illustrate how this is done. Okay, in the next slide, we're going to look into the other value that we needed to calculate exposure, which is the allergen concentration in the food. And we will do this without testing finished product. We're going to use actually estimates, worst case estimates from previous steps. So we said the may contain soy appeared in this spice mix, and that's all the information the manufacturer had. So this is actually not acceptable, not sufficient to conduct a quantitative assessment, and they contact the supplier to get more information. Where is this may contain coming from? So they find that the source of soy cross-contact is actually an ingredient used in the supplier's operations, because it could have been, for example, agricultural commingling or something earlier in the production chain. But now we know it comes from the supplier's operations, and it's soy flour that they use for other spice mixes that ends up in this spice mix as well because of lack of control, I guess. This cross-contact is not systematic. So sometimes they find lots that have soy, sometimes they don't. The concentrations the supplier has measured, because they have measured some lots here and there, is not constant. Sometimes they find a bit, sometimes more. So, but they communicate to us that the maximum level of soy flour that they detect in this particular spice mix that we purchased is 15 parts per million. So milligrams per kilogram. Okay, so we have this kind of not really a fully representative information. We acknowledge that, but we can use this anyways. This is sufficient to develop a worst case scenario. So for the risk assessment, what we're going to do as manufacturers is we're going to assume that all lots of this spice mix that we receive are contaminated at this maximum level of 15 ppm soy flour. Okay. The next point I wanted to make here is that, as you see, the supplier gave us the results in soy flour, but we want to have this as soy protein because this is how reference doses are expressed. They're expressed in protein. So we're going to use, this is simple, we're going to use a conversion factor of 4.4 because 40% of soybeans are protein. And this we can just simply obtain from the scientific literature. So we're going to convert this value by multiplying 15 by 0.4, and we're going to have this as 6 milligrams of soy protein per kilo of spice mix. So now we know how much we have in our ingredient. We know we add 12% of spice mix to the recipe of chips, and we also know we have a baking step, which results in a 6% weight loss because of the loss of water. So now we can do computations to estimate the soy protein content in the chips in 100 kilograms of, in a 100 kilo batch of chips. So we would be adding 12 kilos of the spice mix. If 1 kilo contains 6 milligrams, then 12 kilos will contain 72 milligrams of protein. And then if we consider the water loss, we're not at 100 kilos anymore, we're at 94. So the concentration will be 72 divided by 94, and this gives us 0.77 milligrams soy protein per kilo of chips. So let's go to the next slide. We have the two values that will allow us to calculate exposure dose, as you notice, the food consumption and the concentration in the food. And we also have a reference dose. So Hajar, if you can click several times, there are things that are going to pop up. Yeah. We're going to recap. Oops. Yeah. We're going to use 0.5 milligrams as a reference dose from the VITAL program. We had the concentration of soy protein in the chips as 0.77 milligram per kilo. And the maximum amount of chips consumed in one eating occasion, we said would be 2 bags of chips, 56 grams, or 0.056 kilos. So if there are 0.77 milligrams of protein in 1 kilo of chips, in 0.056, there will be 0.043. And this is our exposure dose, or the worst case amount of soy protein a consumer will eat in one eating occasion according to our simulations. And since this dose is much lower than the reference dose of 0.5 milligrams, the manufacturer decides not to use PAL for soy in this case. Now, remember, we could also do other simulations with a larger amount of food consumed, 3 bags, 4 bags of chips, just to see. But in this example, this is the conclusion we reached. So in the next slide, please. That was an example of a quantitative assessment. As you see, it's not too bad, it's not too difficult, but we want to emphasize this is what you will be doing at the end in specific situations. This is not necessarily something that will be done routinely for everything. Robust allergen management implies, first of all, preceding steps, foundational steps like allergen hazard identification, which should include unintended allergens, not only those added directly as ingredients. We need to look into our control measures to control these unintentional allergens that should be risk-based and should be based on recognized best practices. And all of this, the goal would be to reach accurate allergen declaration. We, of course, advocate for the use of PAL based on risk assessment, whether quantitative or qualitative. This is in agreement with international guidance, but first of all, we need a robust allergen program, and we need to understand the efficacy of our control measures. Only then we would do first a qualitative assessment that, as we saw, can actually help us reach decisions on PAL without doing calculations. And only if needed, we would move into a quantitative assessment where we use reference doses. This standardized process, we believe, would make the use of PAL more meaningful for consumers and for manufacturers. So with this, I would invite you to consult the guidelines. Beatrice is going to explain a bit the type of resources we have developed, and you can download them as well, open access. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sylvia. That was an excellent overview. And just to end off the presentation before we start into the Q&A, as Sylvia mentioned, there's a number of resources that are available at the link that you see here, including the guidelines themselves, training modules that have been developed both in French and English. All the resources are in French and English, by the way. In addition, there are self-assessment tools and user guides. So we highly encourage you to take a look, and we hope that you find them useful. And with that, I will pass it back to our moderator, and we're happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. This was really an intense and detailed presentation, and we are really grateful to be hearing you, our three esteemed experts, and your science and all the work that have been done in this subject. So thank you very much, and would like to open the floor for any questions, from our audience. So if maybe I can start with my question, and this is maybe for Mrs. Povolvo. So how can food processors effectively implement threshold-driven allergen management practices while maintaining consumers' trust, especially when moving away from precautionary may contain labeling?
Well, I think as Sylvia has outlined in the guidelines, it gives a really great overview for two things: for manufacturers to take a look at what they're doing today currently and compare them to the best practices that we've indicated in the guidelines. And for those smaller, medium-sized companies that are just starting and are trying to develop their own practices, we think this is a great roadmap for them to follow to be able to do that. All that to say that when these practices are in place and that there's robust allergen management practices, that consumers can have a greater confidence in the label, how food is being processed, and that all measures are being taken to avoid unintended presence of allergens, which could be concern for those that are impacted by food allergy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And also, I have another question. And what are some of the biggest challenges faced by food industry in adopting threshold-based allergen management guidelines? And how can regulatory bodies support industry compliance also?
Sammy?
There's Samuel.
I could attempt to do that, and thank you for that, Dr. Ruba. I guess actually it's really having the right guidance. What industry is faced with is really to have the right guidance. Now, it's always easy to say, we have to follow evidence-based approaches. We have to base, the practices on scientific evidence. And in this particular case, I mean, a threshold-driven or threshold-based risk management approach is truly based on the clinical information that was generated. It's basically a body of evidence that was amassed over at least 3 to 4 decades of work, and actually gathering expertise from all over the world. Now, the challenge will be, how do we take that and translate it into a guidance that is accessible, understandable, not only to the large multinational organizations, but also to the small processor who still wants to apply good manufacturing practices. And that's really the modest attempt that was done by this multi-stakeholder work, both in the way it was conducted, meaning as Sylvia and Beatrice mentioned, the way it engaged the industry, it engaged also the scientific community, the consumer organization, which was here really at the leadership seat, but also attempting to make this guidance really understandable, in the form of a document that is available, that has all sorts of examples, with the development of some resources, in fact, in the form of a training, some videos, not only in the form of a written aspect. And what I suspect, in fact, that subsequent to hopefully what we will be arriving at as a result of the discussions that will take place at CCFL 48, and if we arrive at a recommendation of a guideline, and I think there is right now consensus from the previous discussions that risk assessment being the foundation for a decision on using PAL or not, it seems to be agreed upon by most of the Codex community. Now, the question will remain, how do I apply risk assessment if I am an industry? And that's essentially what we need to invest ourselves in. And that's what we hope to have started doing with the development of this guidance. But that's also what we hope we will further develop with the collaboration of various stakeholders and partners internationally. Because again, industry production practices are diverse around the world. And perhaps, in fact, this type of guidance will need to be translated to be sector specific, or to be more targeted to a particular segment of the industry, and that's what we hope the momentum will be maintained for the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We have also a Q&A from Mr. Muhammad, and he is asking if digestion of milk proteins increase the allergy or not. So, this is from Dr. Muhammad.
Well, I think this is a question that is probably destined to other experts than ourselves, because this is specifically to a food allergist or to somebody who is also, I guess, quite specialized in terms of the allergenicity of proteins themselves. Well, generally, and here I'm not the expert in this regard, but I will share what I know, with very modestly what I know in this area. To be qualified as an allergenic protein, a protein needs to be actually more stable, including more stable to the digestion, in the sense that, to be immunogenic, the protein will not be able to be sliced, very easily. And that's why, in fact, it creates some immune-mediated reactions. So generally, proteins that are known to be important from their allergenic potential, they tend to be quite stable. And again, I don't believe that there was any indication, at least for milk protein, that the digestion interferes or not in the increase of allergenicity. What we saw is more other conditions of the consumer that may influence the allergenicity or the impact of a food allergen. So, for example, exercise and the impact of exercise on wheat allergies. It was found that there was a relationship and there is an impact in that regard, either a synergy or an attenuation. So that can actually influence. So I attempted to respond from a more generic standpoint.
I can add also something, Sammy. That is that I'm also not familiar with this. I don't know if they're referring to, for example, pre-treatment of milk proteins before adding them to a formulation, and if this could reduce allergenicity. And there are some studies for several allergens that there are different treatments that may decrease slightly allergenicity, but in any case, it's not going to eliminate. So for our case, it's still an allergen, and we have to treat it as such, regardless of the pre-treatment.
Thank you very much. And we have also another question from an attendee, and he is asking us if you know, a quick question regarding ongoing discussion about the proposed draft guidelines on the use of PAL at CCFL 48. There is some discussion whether in Article 4.3 PAL should only be used when it is demonstrated that unintended food allergen presence cannot be mitigated to a level at or below the action level for food allergen based on the reference dose in the table at 4.3.1. The word only should be remained. May I kindly ask your question on this? I think this is part of the negotiation happening at the CCL F48. So
I could start, briefly. And here, in fact, I would direct our colleague here and even our audience to a conference room document that was drafted by IOFOST and introduced to this session. And we expressed essentially our view about how this position could potentially work. I mean, this is really stemming from general principles of protection of food allergic consumers. What are we trying to do with labeling? What we're trying to do is to make sure that when an allergen is there or likely to be there and would represent a risk to the allergic consumer, there is information through the label such that the consumer practices the only risk management approach that is available to them, and that is avoidance. So for us, basically, in this particular case, in the way that that article is put and those principles are put, what we would like is that we would like to have the labeling provisions on allergens to be certainly not taken lightly, so based on evidence. So the fact that linking the decision of applying a PAL solely on practicing a risk assessment, that's a position that we fully support, because it clearly says that that decision should not be arrived at lightly. It has to be after consideration of the situation. And when we say a risk assessment, by the way, we do not necessarily mean a quantitative risk assessment. Sylvia presented in the application an example of a qualitative determination that we see a situation where the unavoidable presence cannot be excluded, and therefore the risk is still there. And that's where we need to put that statement in there. But there is another element that we feel this principle needs to be applied, which is really the parallel between when you have allergens that are present as a result of intentional presence, meaning the ingredient, and the unintentional. And the principle should be the same. Again, if the allergen is there or likely to be there, there should be an obligation of labeling. And this is the element that we did not see in the statement that is put in that particular article. We would advocate that not only should we link the obligation to conduct a risk assessment, so PAL should only be applied unless there is a risk assessment conducted, but we would like actually also to add that when a risk assessment is conducted and when there was the identification that unavoidable presence, or that unintended rather presence is there, then there should be an obligation to use PAL. that the fact that the reliance on PAL should not be left discretionary. And I believe that this will create more predictability for consumers and also more predictability for industry in the way these practices ought to be applied.
Yes, and also protecting the consumers from the risk. Thank you. And there's another question also from one of our participants, which is the reference dose should be based on ED01 or ED05.
Okay, I'll attempt here as well, and I call on my colleagues as well to feel free also to intervene. Again, these ED1 and ED5 levels, as we mentioned, they were derived by the expert group on that was convened by FAO, WHO. It was really developed on the basis of a body of evidence that was amassed, globally. The group recommended ED05 with the understanding that the ED05 would lead to an optimum protection. Again, 95% of the population would be protected. And there was even a statement that even for people that might not be protected, so essentially those 5% that are left are not necessarily left out. It was estimated that based on the evidence available to date, that even if those would react to that level or lower, the reaction would not be considered to be extreme. So essentially the reaction is expected to be mild. Now, when we have these discussions at a global level, it will be very difficult to arrive at something that will satisfy everybody. And in this particular case, our opinion, and here I'm speaking on behalf again of the food science and technology community through the IOFOST representation as an observer, our opinion is that this should be left to national or regional jurisdictions to decide. So even though, again, Codex is there that can give us advice on an acceptable level of protection, and in fact, risk management approaches could be recommended by Codex using an ALOP that is recommended globally, but it should be left to national and regional jurisdictions really to decide that. So long that we agree on the principles that need to be applied, then those other elements, I mean, again, that those lists, the list of ED05 and ED01 are really a valuable addition to help regulators make a decision, but deciding which one to use, sometimes actually jurisdictions might use an ED05 for one allergen and ED01 for another allergen. And that might be also on the basis of national considerations, clinical information that is available at the national level.
Thank you very much. It seems we're getting lots of questions, and would like also to say the question of Dr. Noura from Tunis. Hello, Dr. Noura. And this question is for Mrs. Beatrice. And do you think that something like a certification that certifies the implementation of allergens guidelines can increase consumers' trust?
So, sorry. I think the implementation of the guidelines and the practices that are there, if they can be demonstrated by manufacturers that they are following the best practices that are available, I think that could definitely help to increase consumer trust. And typically what will happen with consumers is if they have a question about the label or ingredients, they will call the manufacturer to inquire. And the questions are becoming a bit more sophisticated than they used to be in the past as consumers become more educated. So they may be asking about, how are you avoiding cross-contamination, what kind of practices you might have in place, and asking about ingredient declarations. So, being able to confidently answer those questions really helps to improve the confidence that the individual will have in the label and in the manufacturer. And as I said, as they look at implementing best practices that are outlined in our guidelines and others that are there available, will definitely help in terms of moving that along.
Thank you very much. And there's also a question from Mr. Tariq Saeed. When is it not necessary to list allergens on the label? I think it's a question. So
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, again, when the allergen does not represent a risk for consumers. So essentially, and this was in fact addressed by Codex, including in fact in the text that moved more on the declaration of ingredients. There are situations where you may be using an ingredient that has an allergenic potential, but the portion that you extracted from that ingredient does not contain the protein that actually would be likely to create the reaction. So this is the example of refined oils, for example, like tree nuts, refined oils, or soy oils, for example. It may be also the case where, some ingredients like maltodextrin is extracted from wheat. It's basically derived from wheat, but it is the sugar portion of wheat as a commodity. And as a result, it's not likely to induce a reaction. So you see here, we make the difference between the commodity that is identified as an allergenic ingredient, and depending on the way it is used in food, you may have situations where the declaration, in fact, will not be useful. In fact, actually here, we would even argue that over-declaration would result in a negative impact on allergic consumers because it will contribute to limiting their food choices.
very true. Thank you. And also we have a question from one of the participants. Does the soybean oils, he's writing, occur allergens and soybean lecithins? So maybe produce, he means.
Well, again, soybean oils, when they are highly refined, they would not actually lead to a reaction. Now, like for example, for lecithins, and here I'm going to quote the Canadian regulation in this context, lecithins are likely to contain protein in them, and as a result, it's the obligation of declaration, at least from a Canadian context, was left.
Okay, and then there's also a continuation for the question. Does the soy right now still the global recognized food allergen, as the FAO WHO expert meeting has removed it?
So again, from a global context, and upon the adoption of the text by the Commission, hopefully this next month, the list will have been fully amended in that soy will no longer be a global allergen and will be a regional priority allergen.
It is very true. And also from one of our participants also, is there an awareness program on food allergies that reaches the largest segment in the society of the Arab region? I believe there is.
Well, that's what we are hoping to contribute to modestly. And in fact, for example, a webinar like today with enabling an interpretation into Arabic is a modest contribution towards that. Within the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, we initiated in collaboration with a number of Arab food regulators, an Arab food allergen and gluten management approach or strategy here, or initiative, I would say rather. And we hope to work really with the regulators and the industry in that particular region to further disseminate guidance, or even actually to develop dedicated programs, dedicated tools that will address the needs of the region, including from a linguistic standpoint.
Thank you very much. I believe that you are doing, G-Force, IFOS are doing a great job with our region, the Arab region. And we've gained lots of information, and we've been educated. And starting from when we started the program of risk assessment, and Dr. Sylvia was one of our mentors, and we learned the quantitative and qualitative risk assessment, and allergens was added through the courses, and now it is being broadened into the whole region. So we are very grateful for all this information. And also, there's another question, if the information, the recording and the slides would be available. Yes, of course, it would be on G-Force website and YouTube. So I believe this is all what we have. And And also, before we wrap up, and we can conclude that I really would like to extend our sincere thank you to our speakers, Mrs. Beatrice and Professor Samuel and Dr. Sylvia, for this valuable insights. And of course, your insights are really great information that were collected together in this one webinar. And this has been an incredible informative session, and I'm sure many of us have gained a deeper understanding of the importance of threshold-driven risk management practices for allergens in food. And thank you again, our speakers, for your expert insights, and to everyone for your participation and interactions. Kindly note that this presentation will be available, as we said, soon on GeForce website, and the full recording, both languages in Arabic and English, on GeForce YouTube channel. Looking forward to seeing you all again at our next webinar on the 11th of November, where the subject will be methods of analysis supporting halal food certification. Thank you very much, and have a great day or great night. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Knowledge we share with pride for a world where health is on our side. Collaboration and science as pillars. G-Force, we aim for rigor.